Pennsylvania, late autumn of 1874. Behind the low roof and the narrow attic window of a whitewashed farmhouse hidden among maples, she had been kept as if she were a mistake, a soft thing to be tucked away and forgotten. While neighbors gathered in the meeting house and the community kitchens filled with the steady heat of bread and the hum of quilting frames, she lived in shadow, her days measured by the scraping of a chair leg on rough boards and the small ritual of washing the one dress she owned until its seams grew thin. The contrast was plain, the bright plainness of churned butter and braided hair against the thin cotton of her life. And then a widowed bishop arrived to settle the affairs of a distant grieving family, and the course of both their lives turned. Prepare yourself. This is a story that will touch where words sometimes fail. Tell me in the comments which town you are listening from and whether you believe that a simple witness tear can change a life. The first cold breath of morning still hung on the orchard when Miriam lifted the latch and let the weak light touch the faded patchwork on the attic floor. She felt the smell of wood smoke and starch and the faint metallic tang of iron from the tiny key she kept hidden beneath a scrap of linen. The same key that fit the iron chest in the barn that held letters and a portrait she was forbidden to show. The portrait that had once been folded into her mother's lap and described in whispers as evidence of a life that did not belong to their plain community. The day the bishop first walked through the lane, his black coat powdered with frost and his hat clutched in weathered hands, the town paused as if waiting for the next line of a hymn. And the hush was broken by the soft scrape of a foot on the attic ladder and a single sob that a man who had lost his wife recognized as something between prayer and pleading. He was Bishop Elias Yoder, a widower who had learned to read the small economies of grief on faces, and his arrival acted as catalyst, not as judgment, but as a question. At the meeting house door, the sheriff from the county seat had brought a sealed packet of papers and a summons that seemed at first meant for another family, for a farm farther along the river. Yet a loose folio, stained and misfiled, found its way into Miriam's hands and into Elias's sight. And old names that had been smoothed out of conversation were suddenly legible again. The world she had been forced into secrecy within began to demand its own reckoning. In the following days, the farmhouse came alive with sounds it had not known for years. The creak of the stair when Jonas the wheelwright hauled down a trunk, the sharp clack of Rebecca's the midwife's wooden box as she examined a seam of fabric, the murmur of the wind through the maples like the turning of pages. Lydia, the stepmother, who had been named by neighbors as sensible and pious, kept a composed silence that was louder than any protest, and the village watched, trading glances like coins, each face a small verdict. The place where Miriam had been kept became, in the eyes of some, a scandal waiting to be pronounced, in the eyes of others, a wrong to be righted. In the attic, Miriam's backstory unfolded not as a neat block of sentences, but as a layered memory that the narrator honored in detail. She had been the child of a traveling seamstress and a man whose name had been pronounced once and never again. The seamstress had died in childbirth, leaving a swaddled girl and a stitch of evidence, a tiny monogram in thread that did not match the community's plain patterns. This monogram had been hidden in the lining of a coat and then in the hem of a curtain before Lydia, newly arrived and claiming prudence, had taken the child as a ward and later as a colder name. In the worst months, Miriam had been told she was a lesson, a punishment for some imagined failing of the mother, and she learned to make herself small, to count the knots in the rafters and practice walking with a neutral face. She remembered the touch of her mother's hand on the back of her head, the smell of lavender in a cracked bottle, the exact place where a button had been sewn by fingers that had gone away. Those remembrances became both grief and proof. Her backstory lengthened into the quiet years of adolescent labor, when she hemmed garments for the farmer's wife and mended the shirts of boys who would later haul hay beside her, when she learned to read by candlelight from a misbound hymnal, recognizing letters as if they were stitches, each page a piece of life to be stitched into a longer seam. Elias, too, had a backstory rendered in careful segments. The bishop, who had won his office by steady counsel and measured mercy, had once been a young man with a feverish appetite for justice.
He had traveled across states to aid fleeing families and had, in his youth, loved a woman who was not of his parish. She had been a bright singer at a gathering, her laugh like the sound of a bell. And when she died young, Elias's grief had tempered his zeal, turning it into a devotion to the humble and the hidden. He had learned the names of craftsmen and midwives and kept copies of birth entries in a worn leather ledger. He had made enemies in the court of the more worldly elders, but also friends among the quiet helpers like Aaron the tailor and Hannah the teacher,
who trusted him with their small sorrows. These backstory passages lingered on character and motive to let the listener feel how long shadows had fallen before the day of reckoning. The township register named more secondary players than one might expect, for the story required a chorus. There was Jonas the wheelwright, who unearthed the chest hinge; Rebecca the midwife, who testified to a cloth S monogram during an emergency delivery; Esther the miller, who delivered flour and a rumor stitched to the sack; Levi the scribe, who had written in the parish book and who kept a copy in his desk; Hannah the schoolmistress, who had taught Miriam to read; Aaron the tailor, who remembered a particular stitch in an old waistcoat; Miriam's cousin Samuel, who had been banished from their household for reasons that would later be explained; and Pastor Samuel from a neighboring meeting who kept a rumored letter. Each of these secondary characters did a small thing of meaning, a gesture, a glance, a delivery that wound the plot toward a public moment. The first scene where their lives collided with the larger world was ordinary and then ferocious. A harvest day that turned private grief into public whisper. Miriam had been at the well when the bishop passed, and their first exchange unfolded like an embroidery lesson. Soft words, questions that mattered, each sentence carrying revelation. The dialogues in that exchange were drawn out, not sparing any pause. Miriam answering in short sentences. Elias asking and kneeling with old politeness. Lydia watching from a distance with folded arms. The conversation ran 8 full turns between them until a neighbor intervened. Miriam said, "I have nothing to offer." Elias replied, "You have everything that matters." Miriam asked, "How can you see me when they have not?" Elias said, "Because I learned to read tears like names." Lydia interposed, "She is a child of circumstance." Elias answered, "Circumstance does not determine worth." Miriam whispered, "They call me a shadow." Elias looked at her and said, "Then let us find the light." Jonas arrived and said, "There is a chest under the barn floor." Rebecca added, "They speak of a portrait and a name." Levi said, "If there is a name, it is written in the parish book." Hannah murmured, "Then we must read it aloud." These 8 exchanges were full of hesitations, of the scrape of a boot, of the clink of metal, of breath caught and released. And every line included a small physical cue, so that the dialogue felt lived and audible in the mind. The community scene that followed was textured by sensory detail in the way an artisan layers cloth. The meeting house smelled of tallow and damp wool. The sun made a white stripe across the benches. A kettle hummed in the corner. The taste of boiled turnip lingered after a shared meal. And the fabric of conversation was punctuated by the sound of a horse stamping and the rasp of a brow. Knife on wood. The arrival of formal accusation came with the weight of paper and the hush of a hand over the lip of an envelope. A neighbor had seen a ledger leaf half-turned that bore a maiden's name, and that name matched the monogram hidden in the dress. Rumors gathered like moths. The second block of conflict concentrated on relationships and hierarchy, on how the stepmother Lydia maintained social order by assigning shame, and how certain neighbors, like Esther and Samuel, aided her silence for reasons both petty and protective. Dialogues between Lydia and her allies stretched across small scenes, always at least 6 exchanges long. Lydia pressing her point that family matters should be kept inside the house. Esther countering that public confession could harm the children. Samuel suggesting that the church should arbitrate, and Miriam listening from the attic until the sound of their voices made her hands tremble. In those conversations, the textures of textiles and food became metaphors. Lydia compared scandal to a tear in an apron. Samuel likened truth to mending thread, and Aaron the tailor offered to examine the lining where the monogram was stitched. The catalyst formalized when the county sheriff arrived with a sealed transcript that mentioned a birth registered in a distant town and a name that had been redacted in the local book. His presence altered the social ledger like a new stitch in a seam. People gathered at the village store to discuss the bishop's involvement as if he were a visiting magistrate rather than a man of counsel, and speculation sparked. At this point, the script places a call to listeners. A small community CTA placed naturally after the rising possibility of exposure. If you felt the weight of Miriam's hidden life press on your chest, write one word in the comments, injustice or hope, and tell us which town you're listening from. Your single word will stand with others who have felt that same tightening in the heart. Your voice matters because these stories are kept alive by those who name them, and because your comment helps others find solace. Now let us return to the lane where a truth was about to be uncovered. The barn raising gathered the scent of straw and iron, the sound of hammers and the talk of men who had known each other since youth. And the discovery of the chest came with both shock and the careful ritual of opening. Jonas pried the lid while his father held the lamp. The wood gave a small metal groan, and the lamp smoke made Miriam cough. Inside were letters bound with ribbon, a faded portrait wrapped in oilcloth, a certificate folded and dated, and a small linen packet with a monogram stitched in thread the color of dried rose. The scene of revelation had to be prolonged. The reading aloud of the certificate and letters occurred with multiple voices exchanging lines, each sentence broken by the creak of a boot or the shift of a cloak. The bishop read the certificate with deliberate slowness, naming the signatures and the date. Levi confirmed his own handwriting in the parish log. Pastor Samuel brought a second copy he had kept, and the complexity of legal and ecclesiastical procedure was described in a short technical passage for verisimilitude. The retrieval of the parish entry required a formal petition to the county clerk, a notarized affidavit from the custodian of records, a 3-day waiting period to obtain certified copies, and a ledger cross-reference number that matched Levi's entry. The protocol called for the testimony of at least 2 witnesses to corroborate the date and the signature, and those steps were followed to preserve the chain of custody and to ensure any claim to inheritance or name restoration would stand before a civil magistrate. The procedural passage was compact but specific to give weight to the eventual public hearing. As the letters were read in the light of the lamp, the portrait unwrapped revealed a young woman in a modest yet finely stitched dress, her eyes fixed forward with a dignity that unsettled those who had called Miriam a shadow. The name written in slow ink matched the monogram and matched the signature in the county records, and suddenly the farm and its characters were centered by a legal fact that no whisper could easily undo. The scene that precipitated scandal and investigation was a public meeting in the meeting house, where neighbors spoke in turns and where Lydia attempted to assert moral jurisdiction. The emotionally charged exchange that followed was slowed to let each blow land in full. The first moment of tension was Miriam being called to stand, and Lydia saying, "Your presence alone disturbs the peace." The bishop replying, "Silence does not make truth disappear." Miriam speaking that she had been hidden and pointing toward the chest. A neighbor shouting, "That is family talk to be closed." And the bishop asking, "Is family a reason to hide a human being?" Another voice stating, "She is of a different origin." And the bishop looking at him and saying, "Origin does not deny dignity." The room held its breath, and the ledger was placed on the pulpit like a stone. That whole confrontation was worked through into 2 long paragraphs of interior slowing and measured detail, as though each word were a step across ice. The narrative lingered on faces, on beads of sweat on a brow, on hands twisting the hem of an apron. In this public crucible, accusations were made that mirrored the most painful moments in the community's life. A cruel elderly matron spoke of improprieties, and a cousin accused Miriam of bringing shame.
The bishop called for witnesses, and Rebecca recounted a midnight delivery where she had found a scrap of cloth with the monogram. Her voice cracked as she described it, and the sound of her confession resonated like a bell.
The climax approached when a formal challenge was made to Lydia's authority, a demand that the parish book be opened and the signatures compared. The community divided itself into factions who either clung to decorum or sought justice. The moment of public shaming was planned to humiliate but became the pivot of redemption. Lydia's composure crumbled when an old letter was read that proved Lydia had once accepted money to take guardianship, and that guardianship had been conditional. The revelation of financial exchange complicated her claim of spiritual guardianship. The narrative slowed. 2 paragraphs describing Lydia's face like an unspooling ribbon and the silence following like the fall of a curtain. Those 500 to 600 characters of deceleration were meant to let listeners feel the public breath as it left the room. After the confrontation, there was a symbolic duel, not of pistols but of words. A hearing in which Elias and a county advocate argued the moral and legal case for restoration. Voices measured and then rising. The exchange contained the requisite 8 to 10 back and forths as counsel questioned witnesses. Lydia defended her actions with faint pride. Miriam spoke of neglect. The bishop appealed to scripture and to mercy. The lawyer invoked the letter of the law, and when the reading of the parish ledger matched the portrait's inscription, the legal balance shifted. In that duel of argument, the small technicalities mattered, and the script again rendered procedure for the listener. The clerk's seal was compared to the county's record. Signatures were cross-referenced with ink blots, and the notary's date matched a ship manifest. All details presented to show that restoration required more than sentiment. Once the truth was public, the restoration of Miriam's name and place followed, with gestures both private and communal. The bishop offered public absolution to the congregation for having allowed a human being to be hidden. Jonas hammered a small sign into the barn that declared the farm's open charity for widows and orphans. Esther organized a quilting circle to raise funds, and Hannah arranged for Miriam to teach reading to the younger girls. Those acts repaired what fractures shame had created. A tender private scene followed where the bishop and Miriam walked the lane beneath the maples. Their dialogue stretched into the evening air with gentle cadences, and 8 full exchanges where confession and gratitude passed like a slow lantern. Miriam asked, "How can I belong now?" Elias replied, "By being seen and by teaching others how to see." Miriam confessed, "I feared I would always be the woman in the attic." Elias said, "Then we will see you at the center, not the edge." She laughed a small sound, and he took her hand with the careful gentleness of a man who understood mourning. His fingers were warm from the lantern, and the scent of his coat held cedar. The texture of his grip steadied her. The restoration of truth led to a public ceremony in the meeting house where the ledger was read aloud, names spoken into being, and the congregation, moved by the bishop's plea, declared that the friendship of the community extended to include what had been hidden. A short passage described the way light fell through the meeting house windows and lay like a ribbon across the floor where Miriam stood. And the acceptance was not only social but practical. Restitution offered in the form of a small parcel of land given by a quietly wealthy neighbor who had been humbled by his own silence. In the weeks that followed, the epilogue unfolded in 3 measured moments to show consequence and legacy. 1 month later, Miriam opened the attic window for the first time with the chest placed before her. She unrolled the portrait and set it on a table. The community had brought her bread and warm clothes, and the widow bishop consulted with elders on the best way to ensure the registry was corrected. Her days filled with visitors who sought her counsel on quiet matters. The small school where Hannah taught gained pupils eager to learn, and Miriam offered lessons on reading to girls who had never had the chance. The maples held their leaves a little longer, and the farmhouse smelled of yeast and fresh ink as order returned. 3 months later, a small institute of craft and letters was informally started in the barn, where quilts were taught alongside reading. The sign Jonas had hammered now hung with pride.
The county clerk had issued certified copies of the parish records, and Levi's handwriting was publicly acknowledged for its role in preserving truth. The community's discussions shifted from who had been to who would be helped. Miriam's name was uttered without whisper, and the bishop presided over a gathering where he spoke of mercy and responsibility. People brought offerings to ensure that no child would be hidden in an attic again. The tone of the township had softened and acted. 6 months later, the change had settled into habit. The farmhouse opened a window seat that became Miriam's place of teaching and counsel. A small memorial was placed beneath the maples to honor mothers who had been lost in childbirth and to remind the community of the duty to care. A ledger now kept at the meeting house recorded births and guardianships with greater transparency. And the bishop, now less a figure of distant authority and more a friend, walked the lane often to check on the families he had helped. His widowhood no longer only a sorrow, but a source of empathy that shaped policy. Those epilogue moments totaled a careful closing that showed social reparation and personal belonging. Alongside those emotional developments, the narrative included moments of confession and a sacrificial witness. Rebecca, the midwife, had offered to testify, though it exposed her own past mistake in a long confession at the hearing. Her words helped shift the balance.
And she accepted a lesser social standing in order to correct the record. The story closed with an intimate scene in which Miriam and Elias stood under the porch light and accepted a slow and cautious affection. They did not rush vows, but found comfort in mutual regard. They promised to labor for others and to teach children to read the ledger of their lives without shame. The city of small houses now spoke Miriam's name with reverence rather than derision. The final sentences recounted the arc of injustice to redemption. That a woman hidden in an attic became a teacher and a guide. That a bishop's widowed tenderness turned into a public insistence on dignity. That the community repaired itself not by forgetting the wrong, but by learning how to witness and to act. If this account moved you, share a single word in the comments that names your feeling and tell us where you are listening from. And if you want to hear more narratives that restore names and bring hidden stories into light, subscribe and be part of a community that cherishes justice and compassion. Thank you for listening to Miriam's story and for keeping such tales alive with your presence.